Thanks for tuning in. This episode is sponsored by Hera Digital, helping SaaS teams fix pipeline inefficiency and build sales systems that actually convert. Comment podcast if you want a free growth audit. In today's episode, we have Sam Chlebowski, co-founder of LaunchBay. Sam is building in the onboarding and post-sale automation space, solving a problem that most SaaS teams underestimate. What happens after the deal is closed, essentially. Sam, thank you so much for joining us here on the SaaS Playbook. It's a pleasure to have you.
Awesome, Jenny, and thanks so much for having me, man. You nailed that intro.
I'm getting really good at them. But before we even dive into deeper LaunchBay, I'd love to go back a couple steps. What were you working on previous to this chapter, and what experiences really shaped how you think about SaaS and systems today to even then focus on an area in business where people don't particularly ever really think of in the automation space?
Happy to share. So to run it all the way back, we actually have to go to when I first got out of college. At the time, I was a website designer, building sites primarily on WordPress. Through sort of curating those skills, I graduated, did the first thing that everybody does when they get out of school, go look for a job. And I started working for this super small company at the time. I was the third employee building websites for them. And this company, Brighter Vision, would eventually grow to serve 5,000 customers across the mental health space. So therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists. And what we offered was a bespoke website solution that was based on a subscription, something that was pretty novel at the time. Now that's totally commonplace. There's all of these like subscription design companies out there. But at that time, it was a pretty new concept. So we had that service. And then we also had a marketing automation, SaaS, to help therapists extend their reach on social media. And it would automate a lot of the posting for them. So eventually, we would sell that business in 2020. And throughout that experience, though, because this was almost 6 years of that entire time, I kind of started as somebody building the websites, moved into a sales role when our only salesperson unexpectedly quit, then moved in to lead customer success, sales, and marketing, all at various points, oftentimes overlapping each other. Throughout that process, I really learned a lot about the importance of systems. So, and not only just like the fact that you need systems for these things, but just what happens if you don't have scalable systems and how things can break and how it can impact a business. And at Brighter Vision, one of the biggest things that we had to contend with at various points of growth was, we sold double the amount of customers we've ever sold in a month, but now we have to onboard them. And retaining them, delivering that service, there's so many roadblocks that can come with onboarding. And oftentimes, they might not even be to the fault of your own team. They're just doing the best with the tools that you provided them. It's so often a systems problem where you are waiting for information from clients. You're following up manually and things get disorganized. And when that happens, when onboarding stalls, clients churn because they don't get a chance to see the value in the service you provide. So that was like the biggest lesson and definitely how I approach SaaS today with that line of thinking. After we had exited Brighter Vision in 2020, I kind of moseyed my way around. I worked for the folks that acquired us for a little bit. I got my taste of working inside a really big company. I think at the time they had around 1,000 employees. And then I quit kind of just on a dime. I was like, this is not really what I want to do, and did some consulting work before getting back into the startup space with actually a podcasting service. And then that was another year or so before our CEO, Perry, who was my boss at that previous company that we exited from, he said, hey, we had this onboarding problem at Brighter Vision. Do you want to try and build something to solve it in the form of a product that folks don't have to build on their own? And that's really how we got here to LaunchBay.
Wow, what a story to unpack there, Sam. There's a few things I wanted to touch on just on your experience. Now, going through different stages and different silos of the business, I feel like it's almost prudent that people do experience every stage of the business to understand where the system is breaking or there is no system, therefore we need to fix something stat, right? So I love that. If I'm honest, a lot of people either experience one side that being front end or one side being back end, and maybe a slight crossover over the two, but not exactly in every silo, essentially all the way through to the end. But what that really tells me is on the back end, when you said that systems break, especially when it comes to the onboarding process, I think what you touched on is building a system where people don't really pay attention to but need ultimately is a really driving force with the way that LaunchBay has been going. It's pretty obvious. There is a very heavy market, and it's not as sexy as the front end stuff, right? Let's be honest. Not to say it's not just as important as the front end stuff. So just want to give LaunchBay the credit and doing God's work out there for paying attention to stuff that most people don't want to.
And I think it's the unsexy problems that are often the ones people need solved the most because you just don't think about them. And a lot of times it's not what you think about until you've actually done the work or grown to a certain point to have experienced the pain because it's like marketing, right? If you talk to someone who's never been an entrepreneur in their life, they would know if they're starting a business, they need marketing. They need some basic stuff like a website. Less common things are something like a CRM. People will be like, why do I need a CRM? I can do it in spreadsheets. This seems to be working well enough. Then you grow to a point, you realize it. Onboarding is the exact same way. But I think it's just been so long overlooked because it's been this thing that you either fall into one of these two camps. And I think that you actually just mentioned that either you don't have a system in place because you haven't needed one yet, or the other camp that we see with onboarding is you've built a system, you know you need one, you are problem aware, but you're not solution aware. You don't know that there are tools that exist out there that are built specifically to solve your problems, and you end up hacking things together in a way that's eventually going to break again, even if it works for a time.
Yeah, 100%. When you said spreadsheets just now, I literally had a shiver down my spine because I'm like, it's 2026. I don't think spreadsheets should exist in any form anymore. Obviously, if you're a solopreneur, I understand it. You got to keep your costs down, but that honestly scares me. LaunchBay really sits in a interesting part of the revenue cycle, as we sort of just spoke about. After the deal is won, what made you focus specifically on onboarding and post-sale automation rather than the early, sexier parts of the funnel?
So, the first and really short answer is we had this problem with onboarding where it was just a constant bottleneck. What we ended up doing, and we went through the full span of tools, starting on spreadsheets, basic project management tool, evolving things a little bit more through time by using custom forms that would pipe data into our project management tools. Eventually, what we realized is that onboarding has two sides that can create pain for everybody. So there is the internal team side where the pain is not getting the information that you need from clients when you need it. So you have time to do the work. So your team can go out there and execute, whether that is activating a customer's account. If you're a SaaS and you're onboarding customers to your product, whether that is agencies being able to produce a deliverable, launch a new campaign, launch a website. You can't do that work until the onboarding is complete. And we saw that firsthand. There was all of these bottlenecks. And the other side of it is the client-facing side. And a key learning at Brighter Vision is that the more customers are informed, the more they know, number one, what they have to do. So what they're responsible for providing with you to get to the next milestone. And then two, providing them a way to know where are we in the process. The happier they are, the less they're going to churn. And also the more urgency they have to complete these tasks because they can see that next sort of milestone in sight. So that was a big learning for us is, number one, there's these two sides that need equal parts of attention. It's not just about your team, it's also about your clients. And then being able to provide tools in a scalable way that's going to automate that. So at Brighter Vision, we had built a really robust system in-house to do this, where we basically retrofitted the back end of a WordPress instance to provide this sort of client portal. They could schedule calls, they could see what they needed to do, complete forms. They could also see who their team members that they were working with were. But it took a long time to build, and it was way more expensive, way more time consuming than what we would have wanted.
When it is sexy, people probably will pay attention or invest resources to resolve it. And something that's quite common in the industry really is they go through the entire process of spreadsheets, type forms, all through, right? And then You get to a point where you're like, "Okay, this is not working," because we're still trying to constantly give it attention and improve it. At what stage and what are some good indicators that either SaaS teams or agencies can really start to say, "Hey, this is a great fit for LaunchBay," or at what point do I start to outsource some of these bottlenecks? And where do you sort of see LaunchBay fitting into the realms of SaaS teams and agencies?
Yeah. So the place where LaunchBay fits in is right after a client raises their hand. They say, "Hey, I'm ready to go. I think we're ready to sign up," throughout the entirety of the rest of the customer journey. But to answer your question a little bit more specifically of like, "Hey, when do you need these systems?" I actually it's very hot on my mind because I just did a YouTube video about this last week because I was looking around and nobody had really answered this question. Because I also think at the same time, it's really important to pay attention to where you are in your business journey because you don't need to be investing in subscriptions and tools that are going to cost you hundreds thousand dollars a month unless you have a real need, right? And early on in your journey, like spreadsheets work great. Standard project management tools like Trello, lightweight, easy to use, they can work great for a time. But what I have been able to distill this down into is there are four sort of leading indicators that you need client onboarding software. So the first is going to be in terms of like needing client onboarding software, the first thing that you should be looking out for is if customers are churning early on in the process. So you sign a deal, they're closed, great. And all of a sudden they're like, "Hey, we want to cancel." If they start canceling before you've ever delivered them real value, meaning before they've ever used your product in a real way that's applicable to their business, or two, if they're churning before you've produced some kind of deliverable for them, that should be a red flag immediately that, hey, there's probably something going on in onboarding. Second sign that we see is if you are having to hire just to keep up with onboarding. And that one can be a little bit nuanced because you really have to understand, what are the things that people are doing and where are the bottlenecks occurring. But oftentimes that that need to hire manifests as team members are constantly digging around Slack threads, email, Google Drive for files. They're sending follow-up emails constantly to check in and collect things from clients as well. They're spending a lot of time just doing manual data entry. They're updating things in a project management tool and in your CRM and maybe a dozen other places, probably not a dozen, but several other places that slows them down. The other signs that we have really isolated over time is if clients are confused and you're having to hop on calls and clarify things, should be a red flag that, hey, clients don't know what to do during onboarding. And then the final one is if you don't have visibility into projects until clients complain, because that means that you have too many clients where you can no longer keep a pulse on every one of them at a given time. And your team members are surfacing things to you that ultimately can result in customers churning out that you're just not seeing until it's too late.
I'm very passionate about systemizing things before they become a problem rather than after they become a problem. So I obviously would love to touch on that a little bit more later on, but from your perspective, where do most SaaS teams get onboarding wrong, and what patterns do you see repeatedly when companies try to scale without fixing that specific?
Yeah. So I think that the number one thing that SaaS teams get wrong when it comes to onboarding is just underestimating its impact. Because onboarding, when it's done right, it can be a super, super powerful lever for things that you might not expect. First of all, retention, great. Customers are seeing value. They're getting into your product. They're successfully activating. And then also referrals. When somebody has a great onboarding experience and they activate successfully, the hard work of proving your worth to them is done. I mean, it's not done. It is a continuous thing in a sense, but if you can get that part right, it increases the chances that that customer is going to tell their friends, their colleagues about you and, really just sing your praises. The other thing is that it prevents you from having to make those additional hires that are going to cut into revenue that could be otherwise allocated to things like additional marketing. Maybe it's additional support. Maybe it's these other things that you might need to grow faster that are really easy to just throw people at the problem. And that's something that we preach all of the time. I loved what you'd said about you make it your goal to help businesses and also internally systematize things before it becomes a problem. And that's exactly it. And with those sort of 4 signs you might need client onboarding software that I pointed out, my take is that, hey, if you experience one of these, look into it right away. Maybe you can solve it in a different way for the time being if you have other things going on. But if you encounter just one of those, it's like time to look into the issue at least, because that means you're going to be able to fix it before it becomes this really big, hairy problem that you can't solve.
People in business often are reactive rather than proactive, especially when it comes down to internal systems. At least in my experience, especially in enterprise level, they're like, there's going to be people within the internal systems that have been trying to bang on this wall for years and years and years to come until it's really a commercial problem. That's only when it gets fixed, right? And hopefully this conversation will help drive that change a little bit more. I don't know what impact it will be, but anybody who's in enterprise level out there and wants to make a change to onboarding, please hit Sam at LaunchBay up, because it's better to prevent rather than try to fix later on. So in our earlier conversation, Sam, you mentioned you work quite heavily both in the US and Australian markets. What differences stand out to you in how those markets actually adopt new tools and revenue systems?
But with our Australian customers, I find that they are much more ready and willing to try out a new tool, especially if it's a new category of tools. When we first started LaunchBay over 3 years ago, at the time there really wasn't a category for onboarding. It was like, oh, you either do this with your CRM or maybe a checklist. I don't know. Now there's a category in place, but throughout that experience, what I've really seen is that our Australian customers, everybody resonated with the pain, but our Australian customers were like, oh yes, this sounds exactly what I need. Like, let me get in there and try it. Where with our US customers, some of the time, this certainly isn't the case all the time, but it required a little bit more education, a little bit more, hey, here's why you need this. Okay, you experience the pain, but now we have to do that work of like, here is your use case. Here's why this makes sense and why it makes sense right now.
Do you think it's because there's a lot more noise in the US with options and shiny tools, which then leads the client or the prospect to be like, oh, I don't know what direction to take? Now, the reason why I say that is because being Australian, we don't have as much exposure to shiny tools, right? Or we obviously do in terms of advertising, but I think we're a few years behind. And when I say a few, probably close to the decade mark in terms of adopting tools and automations and systems. So that's really interesting. Do you see any bigger regions also seeing a greater uptake recently?
So Australia is the biggest one that we see customers come in from, but we also have quite a number of customers in Canada. Our biggest market is the US, but it's kind of in that order is, US, Australia, Canada. So it's interesting that because even in, paid advertising, we're actively targeting Canada as well as the UK. The most traction we've seen outside of the US is the Australian market. And I think it could be that. I think that part of what you said definitely resonates with me in that we have so many software startups here in the United States that a lot of times people are hearing they only want to give a startup they only want to try out a new tool or consider doing business with a startup if they're maybe getting that personal referral, because people are giving referrals for new tools all the time in a really one-to-one way. And I think that in the Australian market, maybe it's a little bit easier to break through the noise because you guys are a little bit of a smaller country. It's not you don't have the the overall number of software startups even in the market that are targeting Australia in any real way.
It's a playground, a very untouched playground at the moment in terms of tools and back-end tools. So if there's any other founders out there that are in the startup space, definitely give Australia a bit more attention, a bit more love, please, so we can start to come to market a little bit as well. One last question for you, Sam. As LaunchBay grows, what metrics or signals matter most to you right now, and what tells you that business is moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so one of our really important sort of North Star metrics. Of course, there's the normal things like, revenue or leads or clients, but like the biggest North Star metric that we see, because it really combines all of those things into one, is active admins. So both looking at, daily trends, but as well as like weekly trends. So an admin in LaunchBay is somebody who is in the team account that is doing the work. So whether that's a team member, manager, CEO, founder, whatever, all of those can count as admins. And as long as we keep that number going up, it's a good sign for us because it also flows into somebody trialing our tool. We offer a 14-day free trial. And if they are inviting their team members, they're inviting other admins and they're in there doing the work, that's a good sign for us that they'll probably convert. And not only convert, on the flip side for customers, it's a good sign that we're able to retain them because they're getting enough value that they're inviting more team members. More team members are adding LaunchBay to a core part of their day-to-day workflows. And that is like, that's really like our North Star, if you will.
It's a very creative way of looking at it rather than sort of vanity metrics, revenue leads, which everyone measures to some degree. More a curious question on the back of that, Sam. If you were to look ahead, say 12 months, what does success look like if you are measuring in terms of admin, so then using that as your North Star? And if you could remove one friction point in the current system that's slowing LaunchBay down, what would that be?
Yeah. So in terms of like looking ahead 12 months, really where we want to be is we want to be spoken in the same sentence as whenever a software company is mentioning onboarding. The same way how like if you are looking for a CRM, people mention two companies 9 times out of 10. They'll mention Salesforce or HubSpot, right? And that's because they've owned those spaces. And onboarding is a newer space, but that's really what we want to do is we want to be in the conversations to where somebody's like, hey, I have an onboarding problem or I need an onboarding tool. We want to be the first thing that comes to mind as the place that you should go to look for a solution. And along with that, there's also some things, just on the development side, things that we're doing that we really want to build as a effort to keep with our goals of increasing weekly active admins week over week. Those things include just delivering delight, both in the internal side of the product as well as the client-facing side, to make things easy, to make it feel like a breath of fresh air where you're not updating all of these things and scrambling. And then with your second question, the friction point is really at the sort of front end or the top of the funnel. And what it comes down to for us is getting in front of the types of businesses that need us the most. And I know that sounds like a totally nebulous answer, but what we've really found, and this goes even back to some of what I shared earlier in our episode, is that there is a type of business that signs up with us, does a trial, becomes a customer, and uses us every single day. And you can look at the trends of they are adding team members every month, every quarter, maybe every week at the beginning. And what we found is that on the flip side, there's a type of business who hasn't really experienced the pain in this real way yet that will try us, maybe just because they want a client portal. We never turn those types of folks away. But what the friction is really honing in our messaging to appeal to these people that are experiencing real pain, because we know from previous experience that there's a type of business that just isn't ready to fully adopt yet. And we want to avoid investing, our time, which is just as valuable as the other businesses out there. Don't get me wrong. We need to allocate our time to the best fit customers. And that means bringing in more of those up front, up at the top of the funnel, those scaling SaaS companies who, hey, they've been able to manage onboarding with a spreadsheet up until this point, but now they're closing $1 million annual contract value deals. Like, hey, it's time to put that behind us. And we need to get in front of them as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, appreciate that. Sam, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. What really stands out is how overlooked onboarding is in the SaaS revenue conversation and how much long-term growth depends on what happens after the contract is signed. And this is a great reminder for people to give it the attention it deserves. For anyone listening, we'll include Sam's details and LaunchBay's details in the comments below and show notes if you'd like to learn more about what they're building. But thank you so much for joining us again on the SaaS Playbook, Sam. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Amazing. Yeah, and if anybody's interested in learning more about LaunchBay, if you heard about us on this podcast, we can toss a 25% discount your way for 3 months. Just go to launchbay.com/playbook.